Reading the first FreeRIDE story was the easy part. After all, JonBuck is still alive. Now comes the hard part. They say dead men tell no tales, but that is not quite true right now. As I was trying to say in the previous video, but tears got a hold of me. A big part of the reason why I'm doing this Let's Read series is both so that I can reread these and just get my head in the right place for the setting, so that I can write further FreeRIDE stories of my own, of which I have currently written 3 that are still canon. Many of them were retconned. I'll explain that later. This story was written by Chris Meadows, aka Robotech Master, and a long time ago, when the setting was new and he still walked the earth, he showed me this and he called it a part of John's new setting. It was prior to when it was the Robotech Master and JonBuck setting. Now, at the time, it was just the JonBuck setting. And he was trying to get writers for the setting. I was one of the first people he came to, though he kind of backed off and realized that my writing skills weren't as good as he had estimated them to be. More on that later. So it is with a heavy heart that I read what is one of the first FreeRIDE stories to ever exist, and that I had ever read. Of course, this is the director's cut, after they'd already gone back and changed some things to build a stronger canon. This story is called Deserted, and it doesn't take place after FreeRIDE's, the other Let's Read I did. It takes place a few weeks, I want to say, before. Oh, actually, wait, I can see it says March 15th. So June, working backwards. Yeah, this is like 3 months before. Oh boy. Now, the reason why I started with FreeRIDE's is because normally I say we should start our stories where they begin, not where they get interesting. But that's not always the case for these things that are written not in chronological order. That, and I felt like FreeRIDE's was sort of the pilot. Like, if you were watching this as a show, FreeRIDE's would be the pilot episode. This, however, was one of the first. I believe this finished production before the FreeRIDE story did. John used to have very similar problems that I have when it comes to writing, where he just wanted to procrastinate forever, and overplan and underwrite, and well, John's over that now. He's not over Robo's death, I'll tell you that. He's over the writing problems. I'm not over Robo's death either. I guess I should stop stalling. I think I've said everything I need to. Let's just dive into it. Chapter 1, March 16th, 1:56 after landing. Zane Brubeck wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and looked ruefully at the moisture it came away with. And there's a couple more milliliters of water gone. At that rate, he'd be desiccated long before he made it out of this desert. Oh, who are you kidding? He asked himself. You're dead meat anyway. It's just your darned cussedness that makes you refuse to see it. Zane leaned about the corner. Oh yeah, this is another reason why why we're backtracking instead of just continuing with the stories after FreeRIDE's. This Zane Brubeck guy, you don't know it yet, but he's going to be central to a lot of the conflicts that that Rihanna, the character we met last time, will be privy to. Anyway, with that in mind, let's continue. Zane leaned around the corner of the spire of rock and looked up at the sun. Still several degrees above the horizon, he quickly retreated back into the shadows where it was only 45 degrees Celsius, or 113 degrees by the old pre-stellar Fahrenheit system. He thought inanely. We should be using Fahrenheit on this dust ball. Doesn't feel right for temperatures this hot to only have 2 digits. Well, as a stupid American, that's pretty much how I feel about the metric system. Either way, he could just barely survive out of direct sunlight. And that was only because he was far enough from the equator to be in what was laughably considered the temperature zone. If he'd gone any further into the desert, that could have been all she wrote. Moving slowly to avoid prostration as much as he could, Zane crawled back into the insulated survival tent that he had been keeping the daytime temperature down to only 35. 95 Fahrenheit, his pedantic brain insisted, almost 3 digits. He still had a few more hours before it could get cool enough to make some distance. He occupied the time by remembering each of his father's erstwhile partners by name and damning him, or in one case her, and the skimmer he or she rode in on. Jim Dinsmore, Arthur Vigo, Audrey Landon, bastards, all of you. He spent a few minutes damning his own honesty and lack of common sense, too. When you found they were cooking the books, why the hell did you think flying out to confront them in person was a good idea? He had to chalk it up to his own inexperience, he guessed. His dad had been the one who actually founded the mining operation, not that long after the new Sarium storage batteries had revealed the extremely useful properties of the cubitite deposits in the deep desert. Clint Brubeck had been one of the old breed of surveyor scout, half ace pilot, half geologist, half cartographer, half mechanic, and almost twice as big as life, to make room for all the halves. With a rickety old surveyor flyer and a suit of IDE survival armor, and that's IDE, I-D-E, not RIDE. There's different types of... Anyway. Survival armor was always breaking down. The suit of IDE survival armor that was always breaking down. He'd found and staked a claim to one of the biggest cubitic mother lodes in the area, and managed to hold it against all comers until the Nexus claim authorities recognized it. Then he'd gone into partnership with several Nexus businessmen to see that the claim properly worked. Sorry, way too much. Anyway, see the claim got worked properly. He hadn't been young even then, and he wanted to settle down and raise a family while there was still time. Zane was the end result of that familial urge, or at least the first end result. He had 2 younger sisters, Agatha and Madison. His father had raised him to be a businessman, then died last year, right after Zane's 28th birthday. Oh, Zane's younger than I am? Holy shit. Leaving him ownership of a 51% majority stake in the mine. His father had never cared much for money beyond having what he needed to live comfortably. He'd gotten more than enough to give his family a good home, put his children through cool egg, and even support an inexpensive mechanical hobby. But when Zane had taken the reins of the business and gone over the books for the first time, he had noticed certain irregularities. Certain it had been an honest mistake. He'd flown out to the mine itself to confront his father's partners. He'd planned to be there all day, touring the cubitic mines and going over the books in details, but after he met with Dinsmore, Vigo, and Landon, and brought up the irregularities, the glances they'd exchanged began freaking him out. He'd cut short his tour and raced for home in his flyer truck. In retrospect, he guessed that the early departure saved him. If he had left at the later time he'd planned, he would have been over the heart of the deep desert when the bomb went off, and the batteries on his life support failed. He'd have to decide whether to put a bullet through his own head or let himself roast alive. As it was, he'd made it the most of the way back to Nexus, and was only 800 kilometers short of his destination, well outside the hot zone, when he'd been forced down. Yeah, it saved me all right, Zane told himself. Saved me for later, out of the frying pan into the fire. Out of the fire into the frying pan. He had survival gear, of course. Apart from water recycling still suit he was wearing and the thermal tent he was dosing in, he'd had his father's old IDE, Chauncey, which is why he'd been using a truck rather than a sports flyer. Sometimes he felt a little silly hauling the old thing around, but it was his last link to his father. He took it everywhere he could afford to, and Chauncey had let him eke almost 500 of those 800 kilometers before finally biting the dust. Zane wasn't the mechanic his father had been, but he had suspected that even if he had been, it wouldn't have done him any good. The desert was strangely inimical to machinery. His father had seen more mechanical failures here than he had in any of the other worlds he'd scouted, even those with just as harsh climate conditions. The commonly accepted theory that it was due to traces of cubitate and the sand interfacing badly with machinery. The constant failures had made mining operations fairly slow going until the first fruits of the original operations had begun to take up the slack. Regardless, there hadn't been anything for it but to take the emergency survival pack and all the remaining rations and water he could carry and try to make it the last 300 kilometers on foot when the temperatures dipped into the bearable range at nightfall. He was carrying a survival beacon, but the ion storms had been bad lately, and he doubted to be picked up by anyone who wasn't right on top of him. But he didn't really have any choice when you got right down to it. He could stay where he was until he died of starvation and thirst, or he could die slowly of starvation and thirst a dozen kilometers away. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was his choice, and the choice of a new generation. He doesn't actually say that. And he'd never been one for taking the easy way out. Besides, his father had taught him a few things about desert survival, and he figured he had a pretty fair chance of making it at least close to civilization to get enough to civilization to get spotted. He didn't know why satellites hadn't spotted him already, but then again, as much money as his dad partner had stolen over the years, he was starting to suspect they could afford to buy some selective blindness. Zane sipped more water, chewed a flavorless ration tablet, and dozed. When he woke, the last tail end of sunset was painting the western sky red, and the temperature had dropped a few degrees. Time to get started. He collapsed into the tent into a half meter by half meter square that stowed his survival pack. Hitched up his belt and started walking. Hard as it was to believe, this part of the desert would fall to just freezing by the early morning hours. Well, that is how deserts work. Unfolded a slightly different way, the tent would make a thermal cloak with hood to hold the heat in instead of keep it out. Neat. And let him keep walking clear through to a couple of hours past dawn when it started getting too hot again. If he was lucky, he might be able to make it 20 kilometers tonight. Yeah, and if you're really lucky, your food and water will last you one more week, and you'll die only 150 kilometers short. Zane pushed the gloomy thoughts aside and trudged onward. I'm sure something will turn up. But the world seemed as empty as the great vast desert he was walking through. Untold hours of trudging later, Zane was coming out of the flat, sandy patches into a section of desert that looked more like Monument Valley on old Earth. There were more spires as well as canyons and pits that made Zane need to move slowly in the dark, checking the ground carefully with his survival light. Sometimes he had to take a detour, adding kilometers to he could scarcely afford. But then again, when he got right down to it, he was probably going to die no matter what, so what did it matter? The desert was almost completely empty, probably due to the lack of rainwater, meaning there was no life to be making any noises. It had been strange at first, but now Zane didn't even notice it anymore. But Zane certainly noticed when the silence was broken, as the eastern sky was just about to take the few first hints of a rosy glow. It sounded like a distant roar, or maybe even a grinding sound. Curious. Zane did his best to fix the direction of the sound and alter course towards it. It didn't sound natural, whatever it was, so that could mean rescue. And from the direction, it wasn't too far out of his way. Whatever it was pretty distant. The sound carried well in this silent desert. After only an hour of trekking toward it, he knew he wouldn't be able to make it by the time the heat had gotten too bad to travel. So he looked for a shady patch to pitch his tent. He was lucky enough to find a reasonably shallow overhang just in time, and a few other gulps of water where he dozed off. And after another few gulps of water, he dozed off, woken from time to time by a repetition of that distant sound. When sunset came again, Zane got walking again. He took another swallow of recycled water from his suit. Wait. Recycled water. Wait. Oh, well, the next fucking few words answered it for me. Trying not to think about where it came from. I was just meant to ask, wait, is he drinking his own piss? But apparently he is. A snatch of an old song ran through his head. All day I faced the barren waste without the taste of water, he croaked. Cruel water. He couldn't remember what came next. But it's probably just as well. He didn't have much voice left anyway. The sound got steadily louder through the night, and as the dawn approached again, Zane came over a small rise and suddenly discovered the source of the sound. He pulled up short and rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was seeing things. At the base of the rise was a small pit or sinkhole half filled with sand, and sticking out of it was sticking out of the front half of it was half of an orange and black striped cat, a tiger. The cat's roars had a distinct metallic tinge to them, and this is what had given them the grinding semblance from a distance. The ground in front of the tiger was torn up with claw marks. 5 distinct claw lines traced their way back to each forepaw. Those talons were dug into the rocky firm, but even as Zane watched, they slipped another centimeter, and another centimeter of the tiger sank into the sand. The tiger looked up, and its emerald green eyes met Zane's. For a long time, tiger and human stared at each other. Zane could almost see the struggle going on behind the tiger's eyes as pride warred it with a need to survive, and finally, survival won. "Help," it said quietly. "Please." Then Zane understood. It wasn't a tiger after all. It was a tiger ride. Given that he owns a mining corporation, and rides probably make up 50% of his staff, or at least 75% of the mining equipment used, you'd think he would know that, but then again, he'd think he would just know that offhand. I mean, you'd think it would just be assumed, but then again, he is delirious and dehydrated, so let's cut him a break. It was a little ironic, given that the Cubitite he had mined had been in large part responsible for their birth, but Clint Brubeck never much cared for the rides. Reticulated intelligence drive extenders. Seriously, say it. Reticulated intelligence drive extender. It's fun! I don't know why, but that particular collection of syllables just makes me feel all giddy inside. It just warms your soul. Reticulated intelligence drive extenders. The animal-based mecha vehicles the Cubitite from the dry ocean desert made possible. The same technological advancements that made possible their animal-like nature and also made it possible for them to operate indefinitely in the dry ocean where all their IDEs faltered and died. But that animal-like nature also changed their operators, sometimes irrevocably if who operated a ride in fuser mode, in which it merged with your own body to provide life support. Even one time you received the parting gift of animalistic features, furry ears, and a tail that would get jammed in doors if you weren't careful. And that was just the beginning. If the gender of your ride was not the same as your own, fuser nanites would adjust you to fit that Procrustean bed. Don't know what Procrustean means. Intentionally or accidentally buying a wrong-gendered ride was called cross-riding, and it was fairly common amongst young men who needed rides for survival in the desert but couldn't afford the more expensive male models. I think they say it later on, but the reason why the male models are more expensive is because they're reserved for military men. Most of the rides are military surplus. Anyway, if he was honest, Zane supposed the bigger reason that his father had gotten out of scouting and mining and just wanting to raise a family, he'd seen which way the wind was blowing and didn't think it was worth adding unwanted parts to his body just to be able to continue it, especially when there were other people plenty willing to do it for him. Yeah, that's the 1% for you. Zane hadn't been as gosh darn it, vehement about it as his father, but he couldn't say he especially liked the idea of ride melding either, or rides in general for that matter. But his dislike didn't just come from the body horror, as much as the fact that rides were fully human intelligent entities that were treated as slave class by most of their operators. He didn't want anything to do with that, and as a result, mostly stayed as far away from rides as possible. But avoiding this ride was not an option. Zane took a longer gulp of water than he'd usually been allowing himself and cleared his throat to try to talk. "I'll do what I can. Hang on." "Thank you," the tiger said. Zane pulled off his tent cloak and folded it, then slid his backpack off and dropped it to the ground with a thud. He opened it and rummaged for a moment before coming out with a coil of nano-weave spider silk survival line. Barely 5 millimeters thick, but would nonetheless support tons of weight. "What are you doing out here anyway?" Zane asked. "Where's your, partner?" The tiger growled slowly, then apparently misremembered that he was growling at the one person who might be able to save him. "Don't have one, don't need one." Zane thought about that for a moment. He'd heard rumors of an enclave of emancipated rides somewhere in the deserts beyond Nexus, but he had always passed them off as urban legend. Now it seemed he'd found some proof. "Well, listen, whether you need a human or not in general," he trailed off, coughing as more dust got into his throat, and took another gulp to clear it. "That's none of my business. I don't care." Tiger regarded him calmly, or as calmly as he could, before his grip slowly slipped away. But if I save you, I need you to save me. Get me close to Nexus, or hell, anywhere where there's people. Then we're even Stevens. Never have to see each other again. Got it?" "Sounds fair," the tiger said, "but hurry, I can't hold on much longer." "Right." Zane uncoiled the rope and then ran to a nearby stone spire about the thickness of a good-sized tree and looped the line around it, but then brought the two ends back to the tiger. "Here." He wrapped around the tiger's paws. Then he brought the slack up for the tiger to bite down on. "There, now, can you pull yourself out?" Tiger Ride tried, straining with its jaw. It reclaimed a few centimeters from the sucking sand, then fell back. "Can't get traction," the tiger said, but between teeth still clenched on the rope. Zane grabbed onto the rope a few meters up, tried to pull on it himself, but it was no good. "I'm not strong enough to pull you out. What do we do now?" "I'm thinking," the tiger growled, even as he slipped another couple of centimeters. Zane slumped down next to his backpack. "What's your name anyway? Do you have one?" "I've had several," the tiger said. "I like Terry the most, so you can call me that if you want." "How'd you end up out here, Terry, if I can ask?" The tiger was silent a moment. Yeah, I know I keep doing the same voice for Zane and Terry. I'm sorry. The tiger was silent a moment, and Zane began to worry that he'd accidentally offended him. Then he spoke. "My latest owner accidentally freed me. Then I ran away." "Accidentally?" Zane asked. "He only meant to loosen some code fetters," Terry said, "and erased all of them." "So you came out here?" "There are no humans here." The tiger glanced at him. "Well, few humans anyway. No one here to force us to do anything against our will." "No one to save you when you fall down a sinkhole either," Zane reflected. "And the radio interference is so badly you probably can't call for help any more than I can." "That would be a drawback, yes." The tiger slipped another centimeter or so, using the last bit of slack in the rope. "What about you?" "A case of terminal stupidity." Zane explained about the cooked books and his father's crooked partners. "All these years they were robbing my dad blind. Now, to be fair, Dad never noticed. He had enough to live off of, and that's what he wanted. But I don't think there's any reason those lousy rats should get a free pass on what they've done, especially when they add trying to kill me in the bargain." "Harsh," the tiger agreed. Zane frowned. "And unless we can get you out of there, where they're going to get away with it, there's got to be some way you can use your own strength to pull yourself out of there. You don't have a winch or something in skimmer mode, do you? No, Terry growled. And I can't change to it to blast out either. The sand would get in my intakes, and my lifters aren't strong enough to move this much sand either. There's something obvious I'm missing, Zane frowned. You can't use your claws to pull yourself out, but... Then the penny dropped, his eyes widened. What if you had hands? Terry's eyes narrowed. No, absolutely not. I will not fuse. Never again. I can't say I'm terribly eager to have a tiger tail myself, Zane said. I've seen how many times those things get caught indoors, but tell me, is it true that your batteries could last several years in standby mode? Yes, why? Terry asked suspiciously. Do you really look forward to spending every moment of the next few years buried while fully conscious? I could shut myself down, Terry growled, then subsided with a sigh. But I don't want to. You make a very convincing argument. Trust me, I don't want to keep you, Zane said. You get me to town, we go our separate ways. I'll have 9 hours of surgery to get rid of the fur if I have to. I just don't want to die myself, okay? Very well. So how do you want me to do this? Zane asked. Very slowly and very carefully. Climb onto my back, Terry said. Put your arms around my neck and let yourself down into the sand until you're lying as close against me as you can. Got it. Zane very carefully did as the tiger asked, shedding his still suit for better skin contact. The sand felt warm against his body, but the hard light of the tiger fur felt warmer. He held on tightly around Terry's neck and shivered despite the warmth. That was it, the moment he would lose his full humanity, despite what he told himself earlier about his real reasons for disliking rides. Now that he was in the atheist's foxhole, he was starting to realize that the feelings of body horror might have run deeper than he thought after all. So now what? The tiger seemed to liquefy beneath him, pulling him down inside. The tiger shimmered and changed, and took a deep breath, then sank entirely beneath the sand, pulling the rope down in with it. Then a moment later, 2 hands burst out of the sand, still grasping and pulling on the rope, and as they went up, hand over hand, a tiger face emerged, then a torso, then hind legs and tail. Then the now human-shaped tiger was standing free. Zane looked around, then down at his fur-covered arms and legs, and back at his lashing tiger tail. This is amazing, he thought. I feel so strong. He heard a growling chuckle in the back of his mind. We are strong, you and I, Terry said. You have freed me. Thank you. Thank you, Zane thought. If you hadn't agreed to fuse, I wouldn't have done it. He flexed his claws, staring at them in fascination. Well, I guess I should get out of you now that we're free. There's no hurry, Terry said with a flicker of amusement. This isn't as bad as I remember. Do you see what direction Nexus is? Zane thought about the question. A navigation display came up before his eyes, the direction of the city, precisely pinpointed on the compass. Yes? Then let's run. All right. Zane turned and ran, feeling better than he had since before crashing, better than he ever had. In fact, he was certainly running faster than ever before. A canyon came up in front of them, and Zane barely even swallowed, gathering himself into a crouch, then leaping inlet with room to spare, thanks to a little help from Terry's built-in anti-gravity lifters. At this rate, they would be in Nexus by noon. At this rate, as they ran, Zane couldn't have said how he knew but he was aware of Terry opening up to him, allowing him complete access to his memories. He saw a succession of owners: a Nexus Reiner who had bought him new and all metal, treated him like he was appliance until he was all but worn out, then sold him for a pittance to an uplift teen who took him into the shop and had the metal swapped out for hard light. Terry had actually liked that one, but he defaulted on the loan he took out to add all the Harley, and Terry had been repossessed. I don't know why I'm so amused by that. It belonged to the dealership for a while, then sold to a rental agency that specialized in desert cruises. After that, he'd been sold at surplus again to a tinkerer, who was the one who had accidentally freed him. The moment he'd gotten loose, he'd been off like a shot for the desert, hoping to make contact with Alcohol's band. But he hadn't watched where he was going carefully enough and ended up in the sinkhole the day before. Zane responded with feelings of sympathy and gratitude and a willingness to let Terry see his own memories in return, except he didn't know how. I see them. Thank you. Hope you like them, Zane said. They don't seem like anything special to me. While they examined each other's memories, the desert had slowly given way to signs of civilization. A few shacks or houses for hermits who could afford individual climate control out here. A couple of last-chance prospector supply outfits, and others. Then they came to the inner-city highway with next-to-city gates visible a few miles up the road. It was getting on towards mid-morning now, with just the tail end of the morning rush passing on the street. You can let me out any time, Zane said. You've held up your part, so we're even. Thank you. He stopped by the side of the road and triggered the split back to walker form himself. The next thing he knew, he was kneeling next to a tiger, reaching up and fingering the new tiger ears and tail that had now sprouted out of his body. You know, I think I'll keep these after all. Souvenir. Actually, I was wondering if you'd like to keep something else, too. To Zane's astonishment, Terry knelt before him, bowing his head low on the forepaws and looking up at him. Zane blinked. You mean you? You did save my life, Terry said. You fused with me even though you didn't want your body changed. I felt how you felt about that. He rolled his shoulders in what Zane guessed was a tiger shrug. All I did in return was give you a ride. I don't feel like I've paid my debt yet. It's okay, really, Zane said. I don't want to force you into anything. And now Zane was purring and rubbing up against Zane's leg. It was a little disturbing. And that's why I want to stick around, Terry said. You're the first human I've ever known who felt that way. I've just about decided you were a myth. He butted his head against Zane's hand, and Zane reflexively reached down to scratch him behind the ears. So I feel I should investigate further, strictly in the spirit of scientific inquiry, of course. Zane chuckled despite himself. Of course. And besides, Terry's voice turned a little older. I couldn't live with myself if the next time those bastards tried to dry gulch you, they succeeded. Oh yeah, them. Terry had all but forgotten, in his relief of being alive. He felt his tail swishing as he contemplated what to do when what he wanted to do to them. It was an interesting sensation. Well, if you wanted to buy in for a chunk of the revenge section, I'll take your monetary units. I'm starting to see the benefits of having a ride around, he chuckled. But maybe I should be your pet. Between the two of us, I think you've got the better survival instincts. Terry purred some more. I'll consider that. Okay, Zane's just joking, but in setting, there actually will be, in future stories that have already been written, but stories I'll cover in the future, rides that keep humans as pets. Anyway, Terry purred some. I'll consider that. Zane grinned. At any rate, Pard, we've got places to be and things to do. So, would you care to show me what your skimmer mode looks like? Terry chuckled. Thought you'd never ask. The tiger stretched out and then flipped parts around to a sleek, tiger-striped hover cycle, floating a foot above the ground. All aboard? Zane swung into the saddle. Terry, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. They headed for Nexus together. Okay, that was chapter 1. This is a 10-chapter story. I'll see you next time, free riders.